So imagine, just for a second, that you are striving for goodness. And I don't mean just everyday, ordinary goodness where you hold the door for a stranger or pay your taxes on time.
Right, not the baseline stuff.
Exactly. I am talking about an absolute, unblemished, microscopic pursuit of perfect purity. Like you want to be the best. You want every single one of your actions to be flawless, your thoughts be entirely correct, and your moral compass to point so exactly, magnetically true north that a hurricane couldn't make it waver.
That is a seriously intense way to live.
It really is. Now, I want you to imagine pursuing that level of absolute perfection so relentlessly and being so utterly, unshakably convinced that you have actually achieved it, that your very obsession with being perfectly good, it actually turns you into the ultimate monster.
Wow.
You become something horrifying, not because you abandoned your high ideals, but because you followed those ideals all the way to the end of the line, right off the edge of a cliff.
You know, it is the ultimate paradox of human, or I guess in this case, transhuman ambition. We are raised, culturally and socially, to believe that striving for perfection is an inherently noble pursuit.
Yeah, aim for the stars, right.
Exactly. We are told to aim for the stars, but the danger really arises when that pursuit stops being an aspiration, like a horizon you walk toward but never actually reach.
Hmm.
It becomes a problem when it becomes an absolute certainty in your own present state. When you actually believe you have caught the horizon and you're holding it in your hands, that is when the psychological ground beneath you completely gives way.
And that terrifying, invisible collapse is the entire focus of today's deep dive. We're digging into a fascinating and, frankly, incredibly dark corner of the 41st millennium today.
It really is a dark one.
For those of you joining us, we are pulling from a massive stack of historical records, but primarily a text titled The Flawless Host, a Catechism of Fallen Perfection.
Such a great title.
Right. Our mission today is to dissect this specific record. We're going to map out the tragic, deeply diluted architecture of their damnation. We need to understand how a group of the most loyal, celebrated, literally poster boy servants of this massive galactic imperium became its absolute most horrifying heretics.
And to set the stage properly here, we really have to discard the traditional idea of a villain.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the sources make it abundantly clear that we cannot understand this group, the flawless host, if we just write them off as simple worshippers of a dark entity or, comic book bad guys twisting their mustaches.
Right. They aren't just evil for the sake of being evil.
Exactly. This entire historical record operates as a grim, sprawling parable about the dangers of pride. It demonstrates, with this clinical and terrifying clarity, that the road to damnation isn't just paved with good intentions.
It's paved with certainty.
Yes, it is paved with an absolute hermetically sealed certainty in one's own magnificence.
So if you are listening to this right now, whether you are a massive fanatic of the lore of this universe, who knows every battle by heart, or you are just someone sitting in traffic who is intrigued by the psychology of hubris and toxic perfectionism, this deep dive is going to explore how the quest for absolute purity is a profoundly dangerous tightrope walk.
It's a very thin line.
Yeah, you think you are walking toward the light. You feel the warmth on your face. But one misstep, or rather a stubborn refusal to admit that a misstep is even physically possible for you, sends you plunging into a dark you didn't even know existed.
Which is exactly why this is such a profound psychological study masked as a piece of military history. To understand the sheer velocity of their fall, we have to start at the very beginning of their timeline.
Back when they were the good guys.
Right, back when they were the absolute shining example of what a hero in this universe was engineered to be.
And I mean literally the shining example. Because before they were known by the terrifying moniker of the Flawless Host, this group was a celebrated loyalist Space Marine chapter known as the Shining Blades.
The Shining Blades.
Yeah, I want to pause on that name for a second. It evokes this image of unblemished, gleaming righteousness, like a sword pulled fresh from the forge, cutting through the darkness.
Definitely. It sets a very specific tone.
And according to the source text, their defining traits as a military force were twofold. They were renowned across the galaxy for their extreme gene seed purity and their rigid mental training.
Those two things are crucial here.
Right. Their purity was considered their absolute greatest tactical and spiritual strength, and the text actually notes it led to glorious, numerous victories on the battlefield.
We should probably unpack the phrasing the source text uses, because extreme gene seed purity carries an immense amount of weight in the context of this universe.
Yeah, for a listener who might not be steeped in the biology of the 41st millennium, what does that actually mean?
Well, a space marine isn't just a guy in heavy armor. They are genetically engineered super soldiers. Their bodies are modified by something called gene seed, which is essentially a biological legacy.
Like DNA passed down from above.
Exactly. It's a package of manufactured organs and genetic code passed down from demigod-like beings. In the Imperium, biological perfection is not just a physical trait, it is entirely, inextricably entangled with spiritual and moral authority.
Wait, hold on. I want to make sure I'm grasping the gravity of that. Are you saying that in their society, if you are biologically flawless, society views you as morally flawless?
That's exactly it.
Like a clean DNA test means you have a clean soul.
That is the exact underlying philosophy of their entire civilization. The Imperium is a regime that is terrified of mutation.
Right. Mutants are bad news in this lore.
Yeah, to them, physical deviance from the human form is a sign of spiritual corruption. It means the chaotic energies of the universe have seeped into your soul. Therefore, the inverse is held as absolute truth. Genetic stability equals spiritual infallibility.
Wow.
If your gene seed is categorized as possessing extreme purity, the assumption from everyone around you, and crucially from yourself, is that your soul is equally pure.
You literally can't do anything wrong.
Right. You are perceived as physically incapable of harboring an incorrect or treasonous thought. You are biologically designed to be the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because that level of biological superiority has to do an absolute number on a person's psyche.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about human development for a second. If you are told from the moment you are created, from the moment you are given this genetic material, that your very DNA is morally superior to the trillions of baseline humans you were tasked with protecting, you aren't going to have a lot of humility.
No, you're going to have a massive ego.
You are basically a walking god among insects. But then you take that baseline arrogance and you combine it with the second trait that text mentions, their rigid mental training.
And that combination is where the architecture of their downfall is really drafted.
Yeah.
Let's look closely at the psychological toll of rigid mental training.
Okay.
We start to see microscopic cracks forming in their foundation long before they ever take the field for a major campaign. The text specifically uses the word rigid. In material science or engineering or even in natural biology, what do we know about rigid structures? A rigid object is inherently a fragile object.
Because it can't bend.
Exactly. Glass is rigid. It cannot bend. It cannot adapt to sudden, localized pressure, nuance, or ambiguity. Because it cannot flex. When it is finally subjected to a force it doesn't immediately understand or deflect, it only has one option. It shatters.
Man, I'm trying to picture what rigid mental training even looks like for a super soldier. I assume we aren't just talking about doing crosswords to stay sharp, right?
Yeah.
Are we talking about intense indoctrination?
We are talking about psychoconditioning on a level that borders on the complete erasure of the self.
Jeez.
Hypnotherapy, sleep learning, mnemonic conditioning, and the continuous, unrelenting chanting of catechisms and operational dogma. Their minds are trained to recognize patterns of heresy and impurity and respond with immediate, unthinking violence.
So they don't even process it. They just react.
Yes. The rigidity is intentional. The Imperium wants weapons that fire when the trigger is pulled, not weapons that pause to consider the philosophical implications of the target.
That makes total sense for an army.
It does, but by making their minds so inflexible, they completely rob them of the capacity for self-interrogation.
That makes me think of an analogy. It's like an over-sterilized immune system.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Think about it. If you keep a child in a perfectly sterile, hermetically sealed bubble where no dust, no germs, no pollen ever enters, you might think you're keeping them perfectly safe.
Right.
But their immune system never actually learns how to fight off a minor threat. It never learns how to distinguish between a harmless piece of pollen and a deadly virus.
It has no reference point.
Exactly. Then, the moment a single everyday pathogen finally gets in something totally normal that a regular battle-tested immune system would just swat away with a mild fever, the body doesn't know how to handle
It
it.
just panics.
The immune system goes into absolute hyperdrive and starts attacking the host's own organs. Was their rigid mental training actually a massive, fatal vulnerability disguised as impenetrable armor?
I would push that analogy even further, actually. It wasn't just that their immune system lacked the antibodies for doubt, it's that their immune system was actively designed to view doubt as an infection that must be eradicated.
Wow, so any second guessing is treated as a disease.
Yes. Their rigidity was an armor that protected them from everything in the physical universe except the internal machinations of their own minds. And we have to look at how this purity and training interacted with reality.
Okay, how so?
The text notes their early victories as the shining blades were numerous and glorious. This is the moment the trap officially snaps shut.
Wait, how is winning a trap?
Early, unbroken, resounding success is arguably the most dangerous thing that can happen to a deeply rigid system.
I have to challenge the logic there a bit. Why is success dangerous? I mean, in military strategy, you want momentum. You want an army that is confident because they've won 100 battles in a row. How does winning become a trap?
It becomes a trap because a system that only knows victory never learns the mechanics of failure. Let's say you are a commander who suffers a defeat. What happens next? You retreat, you analyze your tactical errors, you question your assumptions, you reevaluate your supply lines, and you adapt.
You figure out what went wrong.
You learn humility. But because the Shining Blades had numerous and glorious victories right out of the gate, they never had to process failure or compromise or the agonizing sting of being wrong.
Everything just went their way.
Completely. Their external physical successes in the galaxy constantly, overwhelmingly validated their internal psychological sense of biological and mental superiority.
Oh, I see where this is going. It creates a feedback loop.
A completely closed feedback loop. If you win every single battle, and you already believe on a genetic level that you are biologically perfect, you begin to believe that you win because you are perfect.
Right.
Every dead enemy, every conquered planet, every medal pinned to your chest is just further empirical proof that the universe agrees with your incredibly high assessment of yourself. Your ego becomes a runaway train with no brakes because reality has never put a blockade on the tracks.
That is deeply unsettling when you apply that mindset not just to a single arrogant person, but to an entire heavily armed military force.
Oh, it's terrifying.
You have a galactic army that has literally never been forced to look in the mirror after a tough day and say, well, maybe we misjudged the situation. Maybe we went too far. They just don't have the emotional or structural vocabulary for self-correction.
They completely lack the mechanism for self-reflection, and this absolute unbending belief in their own flawlessness is what set the stage for their catastrophic collapse. They were a towering, rigid monument built on a fault line, just waiting for the Earth to shift beneath them, and the tragedy is that they were the ones who triggered the earthquake.
Which brings us to a really dark chapter in the source text. This isn't a situation where they wake up one Tuesday and decide they are the bad guys.
No, not at all.
The text points to a very specific, incredibly horrific historical flashpoint of the Rilia massacres. And the timeline the source provides here is something I want to dig into immediately.
It's staggering.
The record dates these massacres as happening between 498 and 601.M34. During this era, they begin writing a document that the text calls a Catechism of the Fallen.
Yes, that document is key.
And this catechism encapsulates their ultimate tragic flaw. The text defines this flaw as a conviction of purity so absolute, so blinding, that it completely obscured the monstrous acts they were committing. This is the era where they officially tip over the edge and embrace the dark entity known as Slaanesh.
Well, let's focus on that dating, because it is arguably the most harrowing single detail in this entire section of the lore.
Yeah, let's break it down.
For those unfamiliar with imperial dating conventions, M34 refers to the 34th millennium, so the years 498 to 601. That is 103 years.
Over a century.
Over a century of continuous massacre. It is vital to grasp the sheer scale of that time. This was not a sudden heat-of-the-moment betrayal.
Right, it wasn't a bad weekend.
Exactly. This wasn't a commanding officer losing his temper and ordering a planetary bombardment in a fit of rage. This was a slow, agonizing, methodical descent that was entirely, completely disguised as a righteous, noble crusade. For over 100 years, they were systematically slaughtering populations, and for every single one of those days, they believed they were doing the absolute right thing.
But wait, stop right there. I have a really hard time wrapping my head around that.
It is hard to fathom.
How does a whole chapter, an entire military organization made up of supposedly tactical geniuses, just ignore reality for over a century? I mean, really think about the duration we are discussing here. You were talking about generations of humans being wiped out.
Literal generations, yes.
A soldier could be born, fight in this massacre, grow old and die, and the massacre is still going on. At what point does the mission objective of enforcing purity obviously become a massacre to the people holding the bolters? Are we supposed to believe they genuinely couldn't see the blood pooling around their boots? Or did they somehow twist their own minds to convince themselves that the blood was beautiful?
What's fascinating here is that the text actually provides the mechanism for that exact psychological twist. It answers your question perfectly.
Okay, how did they do it?
The key lies in the phrase, a catechism of the fallen. We need to ask ourselves, how does a catechism function?
Like, practically speaking.
Yes. In our world, a catechism is a summary of religious principles, usually formatted as a series of questions and answers, used as a tool for teaching and memorizing doctrine. So how does a tool for learning doctrine function to justify a century-long atrocity? It works by systematically, relentlessly framing their actions as the sacred enforcement of purity.
So it's a form of active, continuous brainwashing that they are inflicting on themselves.
It is the ultimate tool for cognitive dissonance management. When human or transhuman actions conflict with deeply held beliefs, the mind experiences intense psychological stress.
Right. You feel guilty.
Exactly. To relieve that stress, the brain must either change the belief to match the action or change the perception of the action to match the belief.
And I'm guessing they didn't change their beliefs.
They absolutely didn't. The Shining Blades chose the latter. Through this catechism, they codified their delusion into a religious science. Think about the logic here. Their doctrine says that purity requires the absolute eradication of the impure.
Okay.
They possess extreme gene seed purity, making them the sole infallible arbiters of what is pure. Therefore, by definition, anyone they decide to kill was impure and deserved it.
Wait.
The very act of them killing someone becomes the retroactive proof of that person's guilt.
That is a terrifying circular logic.
It is completely airtight. The Catechism provided the intellectual, spiritual, and linguistic framework to ensure they never once felt the agonizing sting of guilt. They replaced the word murder with purification.
That's chilling.
They replaced genocide with cleansing. When you control the language of your own mind, you control your reality.
So the Catechism was essentially a heavy pair of iron blinders. It's horrific to try and picture what this looked like on the ground.
It really is.
If we extrapolate from what the text is telling us about this 103-year period, you can imagine these massive warriors. They're clad in this armor that was once shining, gleaming gold or silver, but now it is just heavily coated, caked in the gore of an entire century of relentless slaughter.
Unimaginable violence.
They are performing these horrific acts, tearing through civilian populations, burning cities to ash. But as they swing their blades, as they pull the triggers, they are chanting.
Right, the catechism.
They are reciting verses of their own perfection. They are literally using their catechism to build a wall of sound to drown out the screams of their victims.
It is a deeply chilling image, and it perfectly aligns with our earlier discussion about a rigid mind. To pause, to lower their weapons, and to admit that they were committing a massacre would require them to admit they were deeply, fundamentally flawed.
They'd have to admit they were wrong.
Exactly. It would require them to question the absolute extreme purity of their own gene seed. And because their entire psychological architecture is rigid, that admission wouldn't just give them pause, it would completely shatter their entire reality.
The glass breaking.
Yes, the cognitive load of that realization would destroy them. So instead of breaking their worldview, they chose to break the physical universe around them to make it fit. They chose to violently redefine massacre as a beautiful act of cosmic curation.
And once you take that step, once you cross that psychological Rubicon and convince yourself that your monstrous acts are actually beautiful, that the slaughter you are causing is aesthetically and morally perfect, your entire culture fundamentally, irrevocably shifts.
There's no going back.
You aren't just a military force making harsh, utilitarian tactical decisions anymore. You are a cult. And this ideological shift directly leads to the next phase the text describes, where the Shining Blades mutate entirely and irreversibly into the Flawless Host.
The transition from the Shining Blades to the Flawless Host is where they cross an event horizon. The source material states that the culture of the Flawless Host became a dark mirror of their former ideals.
A dark mirror.
Yes. Their obsession with purity and perfection twisted into what the text explicitly and condemningly calls a cruel, genocidal mania. And this is the juncture where they formally dedicate themselves to Slaanesh, shifting their mission from protecting the Imperium to enforcing a twisted, hallucinatory vision of beauty upon the galaxy.
I want to spend some time on the concept of the dark mirror, because it is such an evocative piece of imagery from the source.
It really stands out.
It implies something very specific. A dark mirror doesn't show you a different person. It shows you yourself, but inverted. It implies they didn't just throw away everything they used to believe in, right? They didn't just wake up and say, we hate purity now, let's be filthy.
That is the most insidious part of their corruption. They didn't abandon their core values at all. They didn't discard their drive for perfection. They inverted the lens through which they viewed it.
Okay, how does that work in practice?
Well, a mirror reflects the exact same image, just reversed left to right. They still ruthlessly, obsessively pursue perfection, just as they did when they were the Shining Blades. They still demand absolute discipline. They still believe they are the ultimate arbiters of right and wrong.
But the standard changed.
Exactly. The definition of perfection has become completely untethered from objective morality. It has become entirely subjective, cruel, and tied to their own genocidal mania.
So it's all about them now.
Yes. Right is no longer defined by protecting humanity. Right is defined by whatever satisfies their manic, insatiable need for aesthetic and martial dominance in any given moment.
This requires us to talk about Slaanesh. For a listener who doesn't have a PhD in the cosmology of this universe, what exactly is Slaanesh?
That's a very fair question.
Because when people hear dark entity, they usually think of a demon offering a contract in blood in exchange for your soul. But that doesn't seem to fit the vibe of a group obsessed with extreme purity.
To understand Slaanesh, you have to understand that the chaotic forces in this universe are not just monsters with pitchforks. They are massive, swirling, psychic reflections of raw emotion.
So they feed on feelings.
Precisely. The warp, which is the parallel dimension where these entities reside, is like an ocean made entirely of the galaxy's thoughts and feelings. Slaanesh is the physical manifestation of excess, obsession, hedonism, and pride. Slaanesh is born from taking any feeling or desire and pushing it past the point of sanity.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the text makes a very specific point. That they didn't fall to the typical temptations we associate with corruption.
No, they didn't.
They didn't sell their souls for vast wealth, or to conquer new territories, or for brute galactic dominance like a typical warlord. The source says they fell to the poison of pride.
The poison of pride, yes.
They basically sold their souls to a cosmic entity of excess, essentially to guarantee that they would always be the prettiest and the most correct guys in the room. Slaanesh, in this specific context, represents the ultimate extreme of self-obsession.
It's the ultimate vanity.
It's like a twisted cosmic version of toxic perfectionism. We all know that type of person in real life, right? The person who needs their desk organized down to the millimeter, or whose social media feed has to look completely impossibly flawless, and they will snap at anyone who ruins the aesthetic. Now, multiply that anxiety by 1 billion, give that person an army of genetically enhanced, heavily armed super soldiers, and let them loose in space. If a planet, or a culture, or a species doesn't match your exact, impossible aesthetic standards, you don't just critique it, you eradicate it.
The poison of pride. It is such a specific, fatal vulnerability. The entities of the warp prey on what is already there.
They exploit the existing cracks.
Exactly. Slaanesh didn't have to offer the Shining Blades political power. They already possessed immense power and authority. Slaanesh didn't have to offer them martial skill. They were already unparalleled warriors. Slaanesh simply had to offer them validation.
Just a pat on the back.
Essentially, yes. The chaotic influence essentially whispered into their rigid minds, you are right. You are absolutely inherently perfect. And anyone who questions you, anyone who doesn't immediately recognize and submit to your perfection is a flaw in the universe.
And what do you do with a flaw? You cut it out.
Exactly. When you take that twisted, subjective vision of beauty and apply it to a galactic military scale, you get a genocidal mania that operates on a logic almost impossible for a rational entity to defend against.
I am stuck on the logistics of fighting an enemy like that. Think about how incredibly dangerous the word beauty becomes when it is actively weaponized by a military force.
It changes the whole dynamic of warfare.
Usually in war, you understand your enemy's motivations. You are fighting over tangible things like resources, territory, a strategic choke point, or just raw survival. There is a brutal mathematical logic to it. If you give up the territory, the war ends.
Right, there are terms of surrender.
But if you are fighting an enemy whose only objective is to violently enforce an abstract, hallucinatory concept of perfection onto your physical form, well, there is absolutely no negotiating with that. You can't sit at a peace table with them. You can't surrender to someone who fundamentally believes that your very biological existence is a smudge on the canvas of the universe that needs to be wiped clean.
You've hit on the exact core of why they are considered one of the most terrifying forces in the lore. Their motivations are entirely internal, completely untethered from strategic reality, and entirely deranged from the perspective of anyone outside their specific warband.
They are fighting a completely different war than you are.
They don't want your land. They want you to be a monument to their superiority, usually by turning you into a corpse. And this twisted philosophy didn't just stay in their heads as a dark thought experiment.
Unfortunately not.
It manifested in centuries of real-world, visceral bloodshed. This leads us directly to the long-term aftermath of their fall, as the text describes them leaving a massive, bleeding scar across the Imperium and generating some incredibly bitter enemies along the way.
The specific phrasing the text uses to describe their history as a warband is a trail of beauty and brutality. Which is such a jarring, uncomfortable combination of words.
Beauty and brutality.
Yeah. We know they have a long history of serving Slaanesh and scarring the Imperium. And because of this incredibly long, bloody, theatrical history, the text explicitly mentions that their fall and subsequent actions have earned them two particularly bitter enemies who now actively hunt them across the stars.
Let's dissect that juxtaposition first, because beauty and brutality perfectly summarizes their tactical methodology.
Okay, how does a warband obsessed with perfection operate on a battlefield?
Well, they don't just fight to win, they fight to perform. Every engagement is a recital. They likely see themselves as misunderstood artists, and the chaotic battlefield is their canvas.
That's a gruesome image.
The bolter fire is the percussion, the tactical maneuvers are the choreography, and the blood they spill is literally just paint to them. This makes their brand of brutality infinitely more terrifying than facing a standard, mindless enemy like a horde of feral aliens.
Right, because an alien just wants to eat you.
Exactly. A mindless beast kills out of pure instinct or hunger. You can understand a beast. The flawless host kills with surgical precision, with artistic intent, actively savoring the aesthetic perfection of a fatal strike.
It's the difference between being mauled by a bear in the woods and being dissected by a serial killer who considers himself a surgeon. You know, a guy who is humming a classical symphony while he meticulously takes you apart.
Exactly.
One is chaotic, brutal nature. The other is a deeply intentional, intimate, and profoundly psychological violation.
That is an excellent distinction. And it is exactly this level of intimate psychological violation that leaves a lasting scar on the psyche of the Imperium itself, which brings us to the significance of the two bitter enemies mentioned in the source.
Right, who are they?
Now, the text we are analyzing doesn't explicitly name these enemies, but in historical analysis, sometimes the omission is as telling as the inclusion.
So the mystery itself is important.
The very fact that this specific rivalry exists and is highlighted as a defining monumental feature of their history speaks volumes. It highlights the deep, festering, unresolvable sense of betrayal felt by the Imperium. To hunt the flawless host is not just to hunt a dangerous enemy combatant, it is to hunt a ghost of the Imperium's own idealized past.
Yeah, think about the psychology of those two bitter enemies hunting them down. Imagine you are a commander in one of those pursuing forces. What must that be like on a daily basis?
It would be agonizing.
You are tracking a group that used to be the gold standard of your own military. They were the shining blades. They were the ones you read about in the academies. They were the guys on the recruitment posters, the aspirational peak of what you were supposed to be. I have to wonder, is the hunt driven purely by a righteous need for justice, or is it driven by the terrifying, nagging realization that anyone, even you, could become the flawless host?
I would argue it is heavily leaning toward the latter. The psychological warfare involved in engaging the flawless host in combat would be absolutely staggering.
Every battle is a mirror.
Exactly. Every single time these unnamed enemies lock blades with them, they aren't just facing heretics who worship a dark god. They are facing the absolute, undeniable failure of the Imperium's highest ideals.
They're looking at what they could become.
They're looking at a living, breathing, incredibly lethal demonstration that their own cherished gene seed purity and their own vaunted rigid mental training might not be a shield against darkness, but rather a ticking countdown to madness.
It's like looking into that dark mirror we talked about earlier, but you're being forced to look at it while it's actively, gracefully trying to decapitate you.
It's a terrifying prospect.
You have to wonder if the soldiers hunting them ever catch themselves in the middle of a firefight thinking, they fight so perfectly, their tactical forms are flawless. Wait, am I admiring them? That kind of cognitive dissonance, experiencing awe toward the monster you were trying to kill, would be paralyzing on a battlefield.
And that paralyzing dread is the true ultimate weapon of the flawless host. It is not just their physical prowess or their genetically engineered reflexes. It is the existential dread they broadcast simply by existing.
They infect your mind just by being there?
They force their former brothers, their former allies, to question the very bedrock foundation of their own reality, which perfectly transitions us to the ultimate chilling takeaway that the author of this historical record leaves us with.
The final section of the text is ominously titled The Ultimate Horror of the Flawless Host, and it states without any ambiguity that they are the living embodiment of the Imperium's absolute greatest fear.
The ultimate nightmare.
The fear is this, that the most loyal, the most devoted, and the most pure can become the most damned. The source says the line between a devoted, saintly servant and a monstrous, genocidal heretic is as thin as the edge of a blade. The quest for perfection itself, the very thing they were built to do, is revealed to be the most damning sin of all, turning these supposedly beautiful, noble souls into horrifying monsters.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the 41st millennium, we can see exactly why this specific realization is the Imperium's absolute greatest fear.
How does it shake the whole foundation?
The entire massive, bureaucratic, galaxy-spanning society of the Imperium is built on the twin pillars of unquestioning loyalty and absolute genetic and spiritual purity. That is their gravity. That is the fundamental physics that holds their universe together.
So if those pillars fall, everything falls.
Exactly. If those exact traits, not a lack of them, not a weakness in them, but an overabundance of them, are the very vehicle for damnation, then the foundation of their entire society is compromised at a structural level.
It means the system is flawed by design.
Yes. The existence of the flawless host proves that the imperial system isn't just broken or inefficient. It suggests the system might be actively, perfectly designing its own destruction.
So what does this all mean when we strip away the armor and the sci-fi setting? It means the villain of this story isn't some outside monster creaking in from the dark, unexplored edges of the galaxy. It's the reflection in the mirror.
It's a self-inflicted wound.
Let me try an analogy here. It's like climbing a massive, treacherous mountain. You spend your entire life climbing, aiming for the absolute highest peak of morality and purity, leaving everyone else behind because they aren't strong enough or pure enough to make the climb.
Right, you reach the summit.
You finally get to the top, the absolute pinnacle. You look down at the clouds and everyone else below you. But you are so obsessed with going higher, so convinced of your own divine ability to ascend, that you take one step too far into thin air because you were absolutely certain you could walk on the clouds. Their extreme loyalty and purity wasn't their shield, it was their primary liability.
That analogy captures the mechanics of their fall perfectly. They walked off the edge of the mountain because their immense pride convinced them that the laws of gravity no longer applied to a being as magnificent as them.
The rules don't apply to the flawless.
Right. And the text uses a brilliant metaphor as well that reinforces this: thin as the edge of a blade. Let's look at the physics of a blade's edge. It implies that there is no massive theatrical leap from good to evil. There is no yawning chasm you have to deliberately jump across.
It's just a tiny slip.
It's an imperceptible, microscopic slip. You are balanced perfectly, feeling completely secure, and then a fraction of a millimeter of pressure shifts a single moment where you refuse to admit you were wrong and you are cut to the bone.
And the most terrifying part of a cut that sharp is that you don't even realize you're bleeding until you've already bled out.
That is the tragedy of the flawless host in a single sentence. This historical record serves as a permanent bleeding scar on the galaxy, precisely as the text concludes. It acts as a monumental, terrifying warning against hubris.
An eternal reminder.
It challenges the very philosophical idea of striving for absolute perfection. Because if absolute perfection is fundamentally unattainable for a mortal mind, then the absolute certainty that you have achieved it is the clinical definition of madness.
The ultimate delusion.
The flawless host are a towering monument to the fact that when you stubbornly refuse to acknowledge your own capacity for darkness, when you believe you have sterilized your soul, you guarantee that the darkness will consume you entirely.
It's a heavy, deeply philosophical lesson wrapped in a military history. To quickly recap the tragic trajectory we've explored today, we started with the Shining Blades, a chapter defined by extreme genetic purity and rigid, inflexible minds, enjoying unbroken, dangerous early success.
The calm before the storm.
We saw how a century of relentless massacres at Brillia was psychologically justified by a catechism of self-delusion. We tracked their inversion into a dark mirror of their former ideals, weaponizing a twisted, hallucinated vision of beauty in the name of the chaotic entity Slaanesh.
The descent into madness.
And we examined the bitter aftermath, where they became a hunted monument to the Imperium's greatest fear, that unchecked pride can transform the ultimate quest for good into the ultimate purest evil.
This raises an important question for all of us to consider, even outside the grim darkness of the 41st millennium.
What's that?
If the relentless pursuit of absolute perfection is the very mechanism that guarantees your corruption, if becoming flawless requires you to lose your empathy, your humility, and your humanity entirely, then isn't holding onto our flaws the only thing that actually keeps us human?
That's a profound thought.
What small flaw of yours, what moment of doubt, hesitation, or admitted weakness might actually be the anchor keeping your soul safe from the poison of pride?
That is a deeply provocative thought, and one that is going to stick with me long after we wrap this up.
Yep.
Maybe the cracks in our foundation are what let the light in, but more importantly, they might be the only things that allow the building to sway in the wind without shattering.
Exactly.
Thank you to everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope you walk away a little more curious, deeply fascinated by the lore, and maybe a little more willing to interrogate your uncertainties. Until next time, remember, you might not be perfect, but at least you aren't the flawless host. Keep striving for better, but always leave a little room for error.